This time for real. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have had some terrible trouble getting set up. I had that thing where it kind of echoes and it goes again and again and again, and I couldn't do with it. And then I had the camera set up facing Nimbus's box, but Nimbus wasn't having any of that. So this time for real. We're on chapter 11. It's called Aboard the Hogwarts Express. There was a definite end of the holidays gloom in the air when Harry awoke next morning. Heavy rains were Heavy rain was still splattering the windows, and he got dressed in jeans and a sweatshirt. They would change into their school robes on the Hogwarts Express. He, Ron, Fred, and George had just reached the first floor landing on their way down to breakfast when Mrs. Weasley appeared at the foot of the stairs, looking harassed. "Arthur!" she called up the staircase. "Arthur! Urgent message from the Ministry." Harry flattened himself against the wall as Mr. Weasley came clattering past with his robes back to front and hurtled out of sight. When Harry and the others entered the kitchen, they saw Mrs. Weasley rummaging anxiously in the dresser drawers. "I've got a quill here somewhere," and Mr. Weasley bending over the fire, talking to Harry shut his eyes hard and opened them again to make sure that they were working properly. Amos Diggory's head was sitting in the middle of the flames like a large bearded egg. It was talking very fast, something unperturbed by the sparks flying around it and the flames licking his ears. Muggle neighbours heard bangs and shouting, so they went and called those whatchamacallums please men. "Arthur, you've got to get over there." "Here," said Mrs. Weasley breathlessly, pushing a piece of parchment and a bottle of ink and a crumpled quill onto Mr. Weasley's hands. "It's a real stroke of luck I heard about it," said Mr. Diggory's head. "And I had to come into the office early, send a couple of owls, and I found the improper use of magic lot setting off. If Rita Skeeter gets a hold of this one, Arthur." "What does Mad Eye say happened?" asked Mr. Weasley, unscrewing the ink bottle, loading up his quill, and preparing to take notes. Mr. Diggory's head rolled its eyes. "Said he heard an intruder in his yard. Says they were creeping towards the house, but they were ambushed by his dustbins." "What did the dustbins do?" asked Mr. Weasley, scribbling frantically. "Well, one made a hell of a noise and fired rubbish everywhere, as far as I can tell," said Mr. Diggory. "Apparently one of them was still rocketing around whenever the please men turned up." Mr. Weasley groaned. "And what about the intruder?" "Arthur, you know Mad Eye," said Mr. Diggory's head, rolling its eyes again. "Someone creeping into his yard at the dead of night. More likely there's a very shell-shocked cat wandering around somewhere, covered in potato peelings. But if the improper use of magic lot get their hands on Mad Eye, he's had it. I think it's his record. Uh, they've got to they've got to get him off on a minor charge, something in your department." "What are exploding dust bins worth?" "Might be a caution," said Mr. Weasley, still writing very fast, his brow furrowed. "Mad Eye didn't use his wand. He didn't actually attack anyone. I bet they leapt out of bed and started jinxing everything he could reach through the window," said Mr. Diggory. "But they'll have a job proving it. There aren't any casualties." "All right, I'm off," said Mr. Weasley, and he stuffed the parchment with his notes in it back into his pocket and dashed out of the kitchen again. Mr. Diggory's head looked around at Mrs. Weasley. "Sorry about this, Molly," it said more calmly, "bothering you so early and everything. But Arthur's the only one who can get Mad Eye off, and Mad Eye's supposed to be starting his new job today. Why did he have to choose last night?" "Never mind, Amos," said Mrs. Weasley. "Sure you won't have a bit of toast or anything before you go?" "Oh, no, or rather, go on then," said Mr. Diggory. Mrs. Weasley took a piece of buttered toast from the stack on the kitchen table and put it into the fire tongs and transferred it into Mr. Diggory's mouth. "Thanks," he said in a muffled voice, and then, with a small pop, vanished. Harry could hear Mr. Weasley calling hurried goodbyes to Bill, Charlie, Percy, and the girls. Within 5 minutes he was back in the kitchen, his robes on the right way now, dragging a comb through his hair. "I'd better hurry. You've a good turn, boys," said Mr. Weasley to Harry, Ron, and the twins, dragging a cloak over his shoulders and preparing to disapparate. "Molly, are you going to be all right taking the kids to King's Cross?" "Of course I will," she said. "You just look after Mad Eye, and we'll be fine." As Mr. Weasley vanished, Bill and Charlie entered the kitchen. "Did someone say Mad Eye?" Bill said. "What's he been up to now?" "He says someone tried to break into his house last night," said Mrs. Weasley. "Mad Eye Moody," said George thoughtfully, spreading marmalade on his toast. "Isn't he that nutter?" "Your father thinks very highly of Mad Eye Moody," said Mrs. Weasley sternly. "Yeah, well, Dad collects plugs, doesn't he?" said Fred quickly, as Mrs. Weasley left the room. "Birds of a feather." "Moody was a great wizard in his time," said Bill. "He's an old friend of Dumbledore's, isn't he?" said Charlie. "Dumbledore's not what you'd call normal, though, is he?" said Fred. "I mean, I know he's a genius and everything." "Who is Mad Eye?" asked Harry. "He's retired. Used to work at the Ministry," said Charlie. "I met him once when Dad took me in to work with him. He was an Auror, one of the best, a dark wizard catcher," he added, seeing Harry's blank look. "Half the cells in Azkaban are full because of him. He made himself loads of enemies, though, and families of people he caught, mainly. And I heard he's getting really paranoid in his old age. Doesn't trust anyone anymore. Sees dark wizards everywhere." Bill and Charlie decided to come and see everyone off at King's Cross Station, but Percy apologized most profusely and said that he really needed to get to work. "I can't justify taking any more time off at the moment," he told them. "Mr. Crouch really is starting to rely on me." "Yeah, you know what, Percy," said George seriously. "I reckon he'll know your name soon." Mrs. Weasley had braved the telephone in the village post office and ordered 3 Muggle taxis uh, to take them into London. "Arthur tried to borrow ministry cars for us," Mrs. Weasley whispered to Harry as they stood in the rain-washed yard, watching the taxi drivers heaving 6 heavy Hogsmeade trunks into the cars, "but there weren't any to spare. Oh dear, they don't look happy, do they?" Harry didn't like to tell Mrs. Weasley that Muggle taxi drivers rarely transported overexcited owls, and Pigwidgeon was making an ear-splitting racket. Nor did it help that a number of Dr. Filibuster's fabulous no-heat wet start fireworks went off unexpectedly when Fred's trunk sprang open, causing the driver carrying it to yell with fright and pain as Crookshanks clawed his way up the man's leg. The journey was uncomfortable owing to the fact that they were jammed in the back of the taxis with their trunks. Crookshanks took quite a bit to recover from the fireworks, and by the time they'd entered London, Harry, Ron, and Hermione were all severely scratched. They were very relieved to get out at King's Cross, even though the rain was coming down harder than ever, and they got soaked carrying their trunks into the busy station road. Harry was used to getting into platform 9 3/4 by now. It was a simple matter of walking straight through and the apparently solid barrier dividing platforms 9 and 10. The only tricky part was doing this at an doing it in an unobtrusive way so as to avoid attracting Muggle attention. They did it in groups today, Harry, Ron, and Hermione, the most conspicuous, as they were accompanied by Pigwidgeon and Crookshanks, went first. They leant casually against the barrier, chatting unconcerned, and slid sideways through it, and as they did so, platform 9 3/4 materialized in front of them. The Hogwarts Express, a gleaming scarlet steam engine, was already there, clouds of steam billowing from it, through which Harry could see mainly Hogwarts students and parents on the platform, appearing like dark ghosts. Pigwidgeon became noisier than ever in response to the hooting of many owls through the mist. Harry, Ron, and Hermione set off to find seats and were soon stowing their luggage in a compartment halfway along the train. They then hopped back down to the platform to say goodbye to Mrs. Weasley, Bill, and Charlie. I might be seeing you all sooner than you think, said Charlie, grinning, and he hugged Ginny goodbye. Why? Said Fred keenly. You'll see, said Charlie. Just don't tell Percy I mentioned it. Classified information until such time as the Ministry sees fit to release it, after all. Yeah, I sort of wish I was back at Hogwarts this year, said Bill, hands in his pockets, looking almost wistfully at the train. Why? Said George impatiently. You're going to have an interesting year, said Bill, his eyes twinkling. Might even get time off to come and watch a bit of it. A bit of what? Said Ron. But at that moment the whistle blew, and Mrs. Weasley chivied them toward the train doors. Thanks for having us to stay, Mrs. Weasley, said Hermione, as they climbed on board, closed the door, and leant out the window to talk to her. Yeah, thanks for everything, Mrs. Weasley, said Harry. Oh, it was my pleasure, dears, said Mrs. Weasley. I'd invite you for Christmas, but, well, I expect you'll all be wanting to stay at Hogwarts, what with one thing and another. Mom, said Ron irritably, what do you three know that we don't? You'll find out this evening, I expect, said Mrs. Weasley, smiling. It's all going to be very exciting, mind you. I'm very glad they've changed the rules. What rules? Said Harry, Ron, Fred, and George together. I'm sure Professor Dumbledore will tell you. Now, behave, won't you? Won't you, Fred? And you, George? The pistons hissed loudly as the train began to move. Tell us what's happening at Hogwarts, Fred bellowed out of the window at Mrs. Weasley, Bill, and Charlie, but they sped away from them. What rules are they changing? But Mrs. Weasley only smiled and waved. Before the train had rounded the corner, she, Bill, and Charlie had disapparated. Harry, Ron, and Hermione went back to their compartment. The thick rain splattering on the windows made it very difficult to see out of them. Ron undid his trunk, pulled out his maroon dress robes, and flung them over Pidwidgeon's cage to muffle his hooting. Bagman wanted to tell us what was happening at Hogwarts, he said grumpily, sitting down next to Harry. At the World Cup, remember? But my own mother wouldn't say. Wonder what... Shh, Hermione whispered suddenly, pressing her finger to her lips, pointing toward the compartment next to theirs. Harry and Ron listened and heard a familiar, drawling voice drifting through the open door. Father actually considered sending me to Drumstrang rather than Hogwarts, you know. He knows the headmaster, you see. Well, you know his opinion on Dumbledore. The man's such a mudblood lover, and Drumstrang doesn't admit that sort of riffraff. But Mother didn't like the idea of me going to school so far away. Father says Drumstrang takes far more sensible line than Hogwarts about the dark arts. Drumstrang students actually learn them, not just defence rubbish that we do. Hermione got up, tiptoed to the compartment door, and slid it shut, blocking out Malfoy's voice. So he thinks Drumstrang would have suited him, does he? She said angrily. I wish he had gone. We wouldn't have to put up with him. Drumstrang's another wizarding school, said Harry. Yes, said Hermione stiffly, and it's got a horrible reputation. According to an appraisal of magical education in Europe, it puts a lot of emphasis on the dark arts. I think I've heard of it, said Ron vaguely. Where is it? What country? Well, no one knows, do they? Said Hermione, raising her eyebrows. Uh, why not? Said Harry. There's traditionally been a lot of rivalry between magical schools. Drumstrang and Beauxbatons like to conceal their whereabouts so no one can steal their secrets, Hermione said matter-of-factly. Come off it, said Ron, starting to laugh. Drumstrang's got to be about the same size as Hogwarts. How are you going to hide a dirty great castle? But Hogwarts is hidden, said Hermione in surprise. Everyone knows that. Well, everyone who's read Hogwarts history, anyway. Just you, then, said Ron. So go on. How'd you hide a place like Hogwarts? It's bewitched, said Hermione. If a muggle looks at it, all they'll see is a mouldering old ruin and a sign over the entrance saying, Danger, do not enter, unsafe. So Drumstrang'll, it'll just look like a ruin to the outsider too. Maybe, said Hermione, shrugging, or it might have muggle repelling charms on it, like the World Cup stadium. and to keep foreign wizards from finding it. They'll have made it unplottable. Come again? Well, you can enchant a building so it's impossible to plot on a map, can't you? If you say so, said Harry. But I think Drumstrang must be somewhere in the far north, Hermione said thoughtfully. Somewhere very cold, because they've got fur capes as part of their uniforms. Ah, think of the possibilities, said Ron dreamily. It would have been so easy to push Malfoy off a glacier and make it look like an accident. Shame his mother likes him. The rain became heavier and heavier as the train moved farther north. The sky was also dark and the windows so steamy that the lanterns were lit by midday. The lunch trolley came rattling down the corridor, and Harry bought a large stack of cauldron cakes for them to share. Several of their friends looked in on them that afternoon, including Seamus Finnegan, Dean Thomas, and Neville Longbottom, a round-faced, extremely forgetful boy who had been brought up by his formidable witch of a grandmother. Seamus was still wearing his Ireland rosette. Some of the magic seemed to be wearing off now. It was still squeaking, Troy, Mullet, Moran, but in a very feeble, exhausted sort of way. After half an hour or so, Hermione was growing tired of the endless Quidditch talk and buried herself once more in the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 4, and started to learn a summoning charm. Neville listened jealously to the others' conversation as they revelled in the World Cup match. Gran didn't want to go, he said miserably. Wouldn't buy tickets. It sounded amazing, though. It was, said Ron. Look at this, Neville. He rummaged in his trunk and he rummaged in his trunk up in the luggage rack and pulled out a miniature figure of Victor Crumb. Oh, wow, said Neville enviously, as Ron tipped Crumb into his pudgy hand. We saw him right up close as well, said Ron. We were in the top box. For the first and last time in your life, Weasley? Draco Malfoy had appeared in the doorway. Behind him stood Crabbe and Goyle, his enormous, thuggish cronies, both of whom appeared to have grown at least a foot during summer. Evidently, they had overheard the conversation through the compartment door, which Dean and Seamus had left ajar. I don't remember asking you to join us, Malfoy, said Harry coolly. Weasley, what is that? Said Malfoy, pointing at Pigwidgeon's cage. A dress sleeve of Ron's robes was dangling from it, swaying with the motion of the train. The mouldy lace cuff was very obvious. Ron made to stuff the robes out of sight, but Malfoy was too quick for him, and seized a sleeve and pulled. Look at this, said Malfoy in ecstasy, holding up Ron's robes and showing Crabbe and Goyle. Weasley, you weren't thinking of wearing these, were you? I mean, they were very in fashion about 1890. Eat dung, Malfoy, said Ron, the same colour as his dress robes, as he snatched them back out of Malfoy's grip. Malfoy howled with derisive laughter. Crabbe and Goyle guffawed stupidly. So, going to enter, Weasley? Going to try and bring a bit of glory to the family name? There's money involved as well, you know. You might be able to afford some decent robes if you won. What are you talking about? Snapped Ron. Are you going to enter? Malfoy repeated. I suppose you will, Potter. You never miss a chance to show off, do you? Either explain what you're on about or go away, Malfoy, said Hermione tensely, over the top of the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 4. A gleeful smile spread across Malfoy's pale face. Don't tell me you don't know, he said delightedly. You got a father and brother that work at the ministry, and you don't even know? My God, even my father told me about it ages ago. Heard it from Cornelius Fudge. But then, father is always associated with the top people at the ministry. Maybe your father's too junior to know about it, Weasley. Yes, they probably don't talk about important stuff in front of him. Laughing once more, Malfoy beckoned Crabbe and Goyle, and the three of them disappeared. Ron got to his feet and slammed the sliding compartment door shut behind them, so hard that the glass shattered. Ron, said Hermione reproachfully, and pulled out her wand and muttered, Reparo, and the glass shards flew back into a single pane, back into the door. Well, Making it look like he knows everything and we don't, Ron snarled. Father's always associated with the top people at the ministry. Dad could have got a promotion at any time. He just likes it where he is. Of course he does, said Hermione quietly. Don't let Malfoy get to you, Ron. Him? Get to me? As if, said Ron, picking up one of the remaining cauldron cakes and squashing it into a pulp. Ron's bad mood continued for the rest of the journey. He didn't talk much as they changed into their school robes and was still glowering when the Hogwarts Express slowed down at last and finally stopped in the pitch darkness of the Hogsmeade station. As the train doors opened, there was a rumble of thunder overhead. Hermione bundled Crookshanks up in her cloak, and Ron left his dress robes over Pigwidgeon as they left the train, heads bent and eyes narrowed against the downpour. The rain was coming down now so thick and fast it was as though buckets of ice-cold water were being emptied repeatedly over their heads. "Hi, Hagrid," Harry yelled, seeing the gigantic silhouette at the far end of the platform. "All right, Harry," Hagrid bellowed back and waving. "See you at the feast, if we don't drown." First years traditionally reached Hogwarts Castle by sailing across the lake with Hagrid. "Oh, I wouldn't fancy crossing the lake in this weather," said Hermione fervently, shivering as they inched slowly along the platform with the rest of the crowd. 100 horseless carriages stood awaiting them out in the station. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Neville climbed gratefully into one of them, and the door shut with a snap. And a few moments later, with a great lurch, the long procession of carriages was rumbling and splashing its way up the track towards Hogwarts Castle. And that's the end of chapter 12. Isn't that strange the way Harry can't see the Thestrals at this stage? He only gets to see them in book 5, shall we say. Uh, but sure, well, the movies anyway made it look like he saw his mother die. But, well, mustn't have done if he can't at this stage in the book. But thanks for listening. I'll try and upload this today, and I will see you soon.